After the Afghan government fell last month, Taliban web accounts began spreading news of victory throughout the internet via social media. In response to public pressure, several digital hosting platforms moved to remove Taliban content from their sites. YouTube and Facebook deplatformed Taliban accounts, citing current U.S. sanctions. Twitter vowed to remove Taliban content that promoted violence. And Cloudflare, a web hosting and digital security network, shut down 5 Taliban sites it had previously supported. Deplatforming extremists like the Taliban, however, may have some unintended negative effects, according to Ali Breland, a tech and disinformation reporter for Mother Jones. In a recent article, Breland criticized what he called the subtle techno-imperialism of advancing the geopolitical goals of the U.S. through social media platform enforcement. He now joins us to expand on this. Ali, welcome to the show. Tell us, what are some of these unintended consequences?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I guess the biggest consequence right off the bat in a sort of abstract sense is the extension of state power that tech companies become complicit in when they default to what different states want in terms of enforcement, when they default to state definitions of what certain groups are or aren't terrorists, what groups are or aren't national security threats. And then to zoom in on the more specific issue at hand, it creates a weird sort of precedent in the case of the Taliban where the group at one point, I believe, was considered a terrorist group. If it wasn't, it isn't now. But it sort of flirts in this gray area, and as a result, people called for it to be banned from social media. But there is the reality that it is sort of the governing body in Afghanistan, and what they communicate is very useful for the population there to understand and know about. And so it sort of tugs at this weird gray area of tension that is very difficult to understand and very difficult to come up with a solution for.
Yeah, it puts tech companies in this odd position because they have policies against promoting violence, and of course, the Taliban promotes violence, but so does the U.S. government, so do U.S. police agencies. Some violence is legitimate, or we have a debate over what violence is legitimate, but that's that's the state actor, non-state actor distinction, which isn't really part of the of the policies of these companies. Should it be? Do you think would you recommend that Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, have some kind of distinction between who is considered the sovereign of the state?
Yeah, so that's a hard question to answer. I thought about this as I was writing the piece. I mentioned that the United States should be banned under these specific rules. The Chinese government would, the Saudi Arabian government would. I don't know if it makes sense to do that, and I think it sort of brings us to a different question that we should answer instead, which is why are we entrusting companies? Private companies with this much power, why do they get to make these kinds of decisions and sort of get to be the authority in what is legitimate violence and what isn't?
I remember when Facebook was criticized for not taking down enough accounts associated with the generals in Myanmar, Burma, and then there was there was a violence against the Muslim population there, the Rohingya, and a lot of people in the media said, condemned Facebook for not taking stronger action to take down these accounts. But of course, these were accounts again associated with the legitimate government. So what do you do? It's a really hard question.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think that the ultimate answer is that one, we just shouldn't have private corporations ultimately sitting down, being the ones to make these sort of calls, undemocratically elected, just people who, not through any sort of voting process, rose up just through the forces of the market or whatever else they did to build their businesses. They shouldn't be in charge of making those sorts of large decisions as to whether or not you ban the government in favor of stopping a genocide or not. I think that's just too much power for someone like Zuckerberg or YouTube or Jack Dorsey at Twitter to have.
And so, Ali, these big tech companies, they took action, recently against the Taliban, both for web hosting and social media accounts. But which shows that prior to that, before the Taliban took power, the social media companies and the tech platforms, the web hosting platforms, had no problem hosting the Taliban, or didn't have as much problem as they're having now. So, what does that say about their policy approach to this? Is it merely that when they get embarrassed, kind of globally, that they finally take action? Because you could actually say they'd be more justified in deplatforming the Taliban when it's just kind of an insurgent movement than when it's an actual government in Afghanistan. Instead, they did the reverse, welcomed it when it was an insurgent movement, but then are banning it as a government.
Yeah, that speaks to a very sort of specific and important sort of tenet of this or issue around this, is that these sorts of issues are, these companies love to say that they're very consistent. They have specific rules that they're adhering to. They're going to take enforcement action and apply those sorts of rules consistently without bias. But it speaks to how their perception and what they're doing changes very much based on public opinion. There was the case of James Foley beheading that was posted all over social media. At the time, the social media companies defended it. They said that this deserves to be here because it's newsworthy. It's a really big deal. After pushes from Foley's family, and others in the media, they decided to reverse that decision. Whether or not that is the right decision, other families in Syria whose loved ones were killed, and that information was taken on or was left on Facebook. They don't have that same sort of luxury. They don't have that same ability to pressure companies in the same way. And whether or not you think it's right, whether or not this company should or shouldn't be up, I think it speaks to the sort of arbitrariness of what does and doesn't stay, and how it is often based on PR campaigns.
Yeah, and it also, what's really alarming to me is just how dangerous it is for them to be doing this, because if you've got a group of people that are in charge of your life, or a group of people that can inflict harm on you, I would want to know about that, right? I would want to know, I would like to have some sort of warning that this group is propagating certain ideas that are going to put me in harm's way. And when they deplatform all of these people, then how are we supposed to know that there is this group out there that's a genuine, legitimate threat, or that my government wants to enact XYZ thing, or, law on me, or, even these violent acts of war, or these violent retaliations that you're talking about, removing those from the internet almost keep us too insulated from the actual violence and the reality of what's going on out there in the world and the real threats that are out there. It's almost like we're living in a little cocoon, a safe cocoon, and we don't know the damage that we're even inflicting on other countries.
Yeah, I think that critique sort of gets at it perfectly. There is a sort of knee-jerk slapdash reaction to see something and go, oh, that's bad. That shouldn't be on social media. And I think that the sort of precedent that ISIS and far-right groups have set, rightly or wrongly, of being kicked off is being cross-applied here, and it doesn't make sense, right? This content might or might not be radicalizing people or getting people to be pro-Taliban, but at this point, those kinds of concerns should be secondary or tertiary or way down the list of concerns compared to what the governing body is trying to communicate to the population. Another sort of interesting fact that a researcher and expert told me too is that at this point too, you don't want to alienate the Taliban. Putting them on public display and being able to sort of pressure them into behaving in certain ways that are more advantageous to the civilian population is a really valuable thing right now, and making sure that you can sort of have that general vague communication across social media, even if it's not direct, but like being perceived and perceiving back is really useful in trying to make sure that people are all right and trying to sort of, I guess, bring people a better situation.
Well, and relating to that, I saw a study a few months ago about ISIS's use of social media particularly, and the conclusion was ISIS plots were more likely to be foiled if they're on Facebook talking about them. So even from a law enforcement perspective, it wasn't necessarily ideal to purge the terrorist group from social media. Mm-hmm. Ali, thanks so much for being with us today.
One question that I wanted to get, Ali, while we've got you here, because the Myanmar situation has really stuck with me, because Facebook really was in Myanmar responsible for probably 99+% of the misinformation that was going on, that was directed at the Rohingya population, just seeding these like vicious Islamophobic conspiracy theories that the Rohingya were responsible for all of these horrific crimes, and they really did change the public consciousness that then created an opening for an actual genocide. And I know that that these are the generals who are in power and the recognized government. It just feels like that can't be okay. Like there's something has something has to give here. What's your take on the situation, particularly in Myanmar? Because that's not a place where like Facebook was just contributing a portion of the misinformation and the hate, but basically all of it.
Yeah, that is a sort of thorny bit of it, and that is really important to keep in mind. I think that from talking to experts and just thinking through it, I think that one of the answers to that is sort of looking to sort of more democratic international bodies that don't have the sort of bias stemming from one state. That's obviously very difficult given that, there are certain countries that hold more sway in the international community and are able to sort of produce certain outcomes in places like the UN and in bodies like that. But I guess that they're just like edge cases and exceptions, and I don't know. I don't have a good answer as to how that should go, other than a sort of vigilance and a sort of attempt to sort of think about that more forward thinking in the future and to apply things.
They're very difficult. They're very difficult question because, and we don't really put speech related decisions to a vote even in this country, right? There are ironclad protections in our law for even offensive and dangerous speech. It's the Supreme Court has recognized. So it's hard to.
Although
hard to say.
We would have done something if the same thing was being done to our country. Nobody just saw it because Facebook had one Burmese speaker, who handled the entire, Burma account, despite there being dozen plus languages, and they just didn't seem to have any idea what was going on in Menlo Park or care. But it's not an easy question. Ali, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
And we'll have more Rising for you right after this.